Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I have an incredibly fascinating and incredibly wide-ranging conversation with the graphic designer, writer, musician, general, polymath, Peter Mendelsund. Peter is probably best known for being, until recently, the associate art director at Knopf, where he designed, in my opinion, some of the most interesting book covers of the last decade. But he's also published 2 books of his own, Cover, a collection of his book cover work, and What We See When We Read, which is this really interesting look at the relationship between visuals and text. And then next year, Peter will be publishing his first novel called Same Same, which we talk about quite a bit in this conversation. We also talk about his relationship to graphic design and his restlessness with being boxed into a particular mode of work. We talk about working across mediums and disciplines and his experience writing this novel and working in fiction. This truly was one of my favorite conversations. I couldn't stop talking about it to the people around me for days after and have been really excited to release it for all of you to hear. In a sort of roundabout way, we cover so much of what I usually talk about, but Peter's approach was just so inspiring and interesting to me. Early in the conversation, he mentions Jenny Ophil's notion of the art monster, and this term art monster really guides a lot of the conversation and made for what I think is a really honest and profound conversation. I'm really excited for you to hear it. Remember, if you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year to receive an exclusive monthly newsletter with additional content and episode previews. Memberships really help keep the podcast going, and I just really appreciate all of your support. And for right now, I hope that you enjoy this really great conversation with Peter Mendelsund. Start these conversations kind of talking about people's background, how they got into design, that sort of thing. I feel like we don't need to do that. I feel like you've talked about that a lot. I feel like that story is really well known. We can point people to plenty of other interviews where you've talked about that.
Okay.
But
I mean, the only thing that's really relevant there is that the process that I underwent becoming a designer, I feel like I'm now undergoing that process again, sort of. I don't want to say extracting myself from design, but it's the process and the feelings that associated with the process are remarkably similar, moving from design to writing prose, as the feelings that I felt when I was leaving music to start designing. It's wrenching and exciting in the exact same ways.
Okay, so this is either perfect or going to completely throw off all the questions I had planned. But I was curious how writing kind of fit into to this story that, you've talked about this transition from music to design. And the reason I asked that is, and I don't mean to call back to something you've written years ago, but I remember very vividly when you announced What We See When We Read. And it was almost a parenthetical where you just said, I'd written books before, but never published any of them or something. And it sounded so offhanded, but it also was like, writing is a big part of you or your identity. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, anybody that I know who writes books has those buried skeletal books somewhere in their closet.
Right.
I mean, most writers that I know have aborted novels, and my past is definitely littered with ideas I was really excited about, but just didn't have the wherewithal to carry through. And in some ways, I feel like writing is, obviously, I'm interested in a variety of media.
Right.
And I'm interested in what those media can do for me. And I found that actually writing is both still easier on the one hand than performing classical music. On the other hand, much more satisfying and rich an arena to work in than graphic design.
Yeah.
So in a way, it's sort of a sweet spot between the two mediums that I have had experience with. I really like it. There is a lot to communicate. The bandwidth feels larger than the, say, even just psycho-emotional bandwidth of what you can communicate in a work of design.
Right.
You know, when you're writing, it's much more comparable to that emotional bandwidth that you have with music, right?
So were you writing, like, you know, as you were becoming a designer, as you were playing music, did you always write? Did you always have, you know, ambitions or an interest in that?
I don't know if I had ambitions to be a writer specifically. Okay. It's funny. Did you ever read Jenny Offel's book, Department of Speculation?
No, but it's one of those that's been on my list for years.
So the main character in that book has an expression that she uses to describe, I guess, what she is, sort of aspirationally, and that is an art monster. Okay. And as soon as I read that phrase, I thought, yeah, that is really what I always wanted to be, was an art monster. It didn't really matter sort of what the medium was, but I wanted to have my life be tied up in making things that didn't exist before.
Right.
And I sort of thought about it as, you know, initially it was making music. Obviously that's problematic. It's funny, I was actually just watching the Winter Olympics and seeing all the Olympic skaters. It's always sort of the field that feels the most comparable to me to being a classical musician, in the sense that the stakes are ridiculously high. It's mostly about kind of technical perfection. You have to start when you're very, very young. You can only do it so long, and then after that you kind of are forced to reinvent yourself.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
And, you know, what you see is a ton of burnout.
Right.
Anyway, I guess this is a very long answer to your question, but I you know, what I'm finding is the older I get, the more I realize that being an art monster, you don't have to devote that monstrousness to a single medium. You could create a kind of constellation of interests and methodologies and forms, and they can all inform one another. And I'm sort of hoping that's, I'm sorry, I'm going on.
No, this is what I love. This is what this is for.
It's funny. I think we live in an era. It's oft remarked upon that we live in an era of extreme specialization. It's often really verboten to try your hand at a variety of things because it's considered dabbling. Mm-hmm. And so there's this stigma that's attached to it that I find that I come up against all the time. Weirdly, not so much externally, but definitely internally. I have my own kind of prejudices around it.
Yeah, and, I know exactly what you're talking about.
You know, my imposter syndrome that I have anyway is definitely amplified by that thinking that, you know, who do you think you are doing this?
Right.
You know?
Right.
And I think it's especially hard once you've your name has sort of become attached to one particular thing, i.e. making book jackets. I think it's even harder. And yet I knew when I started designing book jackets, as much as I knew that I loved it and I really enjoyed doing it and maybe had some ability in doing it, that it was kind of a way station, that it wasn't going to be something I was always going to... I just knew that it wasn't going to be something I was always going to be doing. I mean, I hope I do always do it. Yeah. It's just not always going to be the be-all, end-all for me.
Well, and I remember, I'm sorry that my first two questions are quoting things that you have written before. I usually try not to do that, but as I was kind of thinking about this, I was reminded of, I think it was the introduction to Cover, and you talk about exactly what you're talking about now, that kind of unsure if you can call yourself a designer, and that, almost like you're hedging, I think was the word that you used.
Oh, yeah, actually. That's right. Actually, yeah, the word was hedging. Self-definition's hard.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing I struggle with is this idea that while we're all aspiring to be one thing or other, the thing that we're actually doing is our work in the world, right? I often think about someone like Leonard Bernstein, who all he wanted to be was a respected classical. He wanted to be Aaron Copland, right?
Right.
In the meantime, he wrote like the greatest American musical, was one of our greatest conductors of all time. And, I often think about, I mean, this is so confessional to be saying, but my worry is that, maybe I'm a graphic designer. I still don't know if I'm a graphic designer.
Yeah.
But my interests are not, that label doesn't circumscribe my interests. There's way more to do in the world.
Okay, so that's why I brought that up, though, is because you end that introduction basically saying that the task of the designer was bigger than maybe what you initially thought it was, and that's something that really resonated with me when I got the book and when it came out, because I, at the time, and as we were kind of talking about before we recorded, still kind of feel like maybe, I gotten into this career that graphic design was this thing that it's the only thing I ever wanted to do. And then I was like, wait, is this really all it is? This isn't, this is not what I see kind of the rest of my career doing.
You're not alone in feeling that way.
and this kind of realization that graphic design, in quotes, can actually be a lot of different types of things. And that can expand. I'm curious kind of what you think about that, or even kind of how that term or that title has evolved for you.
Honestly, I'm still not entirely sure what design even means. I mean, obviously, I've read what many people have had to say about that question, and other than the sort of commercial aspects of the thing, as opposed to the pure aspects of fine arts or making music or writing a book or whatever, I don't know what it really means to be a designer. I mean, interestingly, since I started actually designing, making book jackets and various other things, I look at other art forms with a different kind of eye, like an eye more to sort of architecture and I see patterns a lot more than I used to, whether it's playing a piece of music or reading someone else's novel. I'm just much more keyed into sort of those kind of architectonics than I used to be. And I think design has definitely allowed me on some level to feel a little bit freer about making things, in the sense that, I know that when I sit down with an InDesign file, I can throw some colors and type together and it can be okay and it can work, and it doesn't have to be necessarily a work of genius for people to like it. And, and that it's sort of about navigating that rectangle on my screen.
Yeah.
It sounds very simple to say it, and it actually is kind of simple. And in a way, what I'm trying to do now is translate those feelings onto these other art forms that are so much more laden in terms of the sort of importance that we put on them culturally. And I'm trying to maintain that feeling of just sort of like working in the rectangle, that sort of ease and play of... And it really, actually, I think that design has really helped me in that regard. It's definitely freed me up to just not be so self-serious.
Oh, interesting. So does that... I have a question. I don't know exactly kind of how... I want to connect this back to writing a little bit, because you had said early on, and I wanted to come back to it, that writing gives you a certain gratification or something that that kind of design doesn't. Do you think being a designer now has changed how you think about writing also, and the actual kind of act of writing?
Definitely. What's funny is, like, writing the novel was an interesting experience, because I started writing writing a novel is a process, right? You tend to not write a novel using the same methodology at the beginning that you use at the end, because it just takes so fucking long to do. Oh, sorry about the...
Oh no, this is a this is not on the radio.
But and especially I think for me, like, I'm learning how to write in some ways in public on all of my projects. I've been sort of just like I've been learning how to do this thing and putting things out there. And one of the things I learned, what I'm trying to say is, when I started working on the novel, I started very, very micro. I started in a way that was trying to squeeze as much expression out of a sentence as I every single sentence as I could, to go like straight for profundity, straight for poetry, for rhythm, for, everything had to be just sort of like luminous, perfect, and deep diving.
Yeah.
And the more I've been working on this thing, the more I've started to think about the sort of the smallest unit of the novel as the chapter rather than the word or the sentence.
Oh, interesting.
The more it's starting to feel like design. Like I'm like, well, this would be a great spot for me to do X, Y, or Z. And so I throw X, Y, or Z in there. And all of a sudden, now that the component pieces are bigger and I'm freer and I'm not so worried about the sentence level, it really does feel like design now.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So this connects back to something I was thinking about as I was on my way here, actually, is that I remember reading the blog that you ran at the time, Jacket Mechanical.
Oh, years ago, yep.
And that, as you were kind of learning design in a way, I think you could say that you were kind of writing about it and publishing online about it.
Right.
But it was very much about the work. It was about the work you were doing. It's about kind of what you were thinking about design. And even what we see when we read, I think, is essentially a design book. It's obviously about a lot bigger ideas, but I think it's kind of rooted in design.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of curious about the novel, and that seems very different than the writing that you've done in public so far, from what you're kind of talking about, and just the fact that it's a novel and not.
It's super duper, isn't it? Actually.
Okay.
I mean, okay. So speaking to the blog.
Yeah.
I tell people all the time who are interested in writing, it's such a fantastic way to sort of bring some, albeit low stakes, but stakes into the equation. And having some stakes, a deadline, whatever it is such a great way to actually get yourself to accomplish a piece of writing.
Yeah.
So for me, it was just, and sort of like to kind of like bridge the loneliness of having to work these things out by yourself and not knowing if you're losing your mind or not, which is one of the reasons why we just make things, period. And it, what's nice about it is you find that you have an audience and it gives you confidence. And anyway, to the thrust of your question, which is really about design writing, I think, as opposed to other kind of writing, the novel is really still about the same concerns that what we see was about, in the sense that, what we see, you're right, it is a design book in the sense that it's about the visual field. But really, it's a book about what it means to, this sounds so grandiose, and I don't mean it that way, but what I mean is it's a book that's about being alive and sort of how we apprehend the world in front of us. Is the world given to us in the way that we are told that the world is given to us, in the sort of habitual way that we've come to understand that the world is given to us, right? As a philosophy major, as an undergrad, in some ways I think that is really the kernel of all the writing I do, is sort of getting to the bottom of what's, I have this propensity that most undergraduate philosophy students have of being sort of naturally skeptical and just wanting to poke a stick at whatever anybody's hallowed assumption is about anything, right? It's a shitty property to have, especially at a dinner party. But I just find that like truisms about how the world works, I find annoying. So when someone says to me like, I only read novels where I can clearly see the main character, I really want to unpack that comment, interrogate it a little bit, and see what that means. And so that's sort of that was really the impetus for, on some level, what we see when we read, is to sort of examine a little bit in my own, self-reflectively, like my own phenomenology. What is that like? And in a way, the novel's the same thing. Like for me, the novel is, it's very much, I should say, a novel of ideas as opposed to a novel of like plot. It's not the Da Vinci Code or anything. It has a plot and it has characters, but really I
don't think anyone, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I don't think anyone was expecting you to write a novel that was like the Da Vinci Code.
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I've been saying to everybody who asks about it, the first words out of my mouth are always like, it's a really weird book. To the extent that my editor has told me to stop saying that, like it's really off-putting. But the people that know me have said like, we wouldn't expect anything else of you. We're glad that it's And what I really hope it is, on some level, I should say the novel is called Same, and it's coming out in February. And it should be around 400 pages, and it's about a guy who goes to an arts colony in a sort of far-flung place, and crazy shit ensues. But I should also say that it's a novel that's really investigating the idea of how we communicate with one another, which is the sort of fundamental design idea.
Right.
Specifically, I am really interested in the way in which things replace other things. I mean, I talked in What We See when we read about the idea of metonymy and synecdoche and the way in which metaphor functions. And, we live in an age now where most of our time on the planet is spent interacting with people through avatars and emblems and symbols of various kinds. Right. And this has become not just an abstract exercise. It's become the way the media has shaped the way we think about the world. It's become a really pressing question.
Yeah.
And it has, the form, the platform has presented all kinds of dangers to the way we live and the way we think and the way we digest not just the news, but the world around us in general. So I'm very interested in this idea of, these sort of fundamental semiotic questions. Yeah. So really, this is what the novel is about. It's about, so on the face of it, it's about this art colony, but it's really about this guy in this strange world where you can't really tell if it's the present or the future. It's kind of like a desert world, sort of like a Doha, Abu Dhabi style place, although it could be a post-apocalyptic land. This arts colony that he goes to is under a dome. And so there's a weird kind of almost Logan's Run flavor to the whole thing. It's a very, very strange book, but he encounters in this strange new world, this strange city where there are, like Doha or Abu Dhabi, where there are all of these simulacrum kind of environments, right? They're indoor ski slopes and fake Venices and Eiffel Towers in the middle of scorched plains. And there are all of these sort of, doppelgangers, right? Yeah. And he discovers a place called the Same Store. And now there are same stores. This is a thing in the Arabic world, and in Asia as well, where there are these shops where you bring them things and they'll duplicate them.
Oh, okay. I didn't know.
Yeah, and there happens to be a place called the Same Shop, which is in Doha and Qatar.
Oh, okay.
That a friend of mine has visited. He gets his shirts made there, and you just bring them an item and they'll make you a new one.
Oh, wow. I've never heard of this. Actually.
Yes, right. Actually, I have the business card from the Same Shop. Anyway, so this character of mine encounters this place, and for a variety of reasons has to get something, a duplicate of something made, and it just the book is sort of a story of kind of escalating sames, which ends up being. It's not the kind of book where a spoiler will really matter. Like I said, it's really a book of ideas, but it's a doppelganger story on some level. And the book, I think, is really trying to contend with how many us's are there in the world, and how are these various we's and I's actually doing a decent job of presenting the, if you can say such a thing, real or erratic we's, us's, and I's into the world, and what that sort of, the diminution of our personality and the sort of interesting richness of our being, how when that's consolidated into a logo or an emblem or an avatar or an emoji or our voice on a thread online, the damage that gets done when we're shrunk down to these sort of alternate selves. Yeah. So,
I mean,
that's a lot to throw at
you. I have like 30 questions now, and so I'm afraid that I'm just going to kill the momentum that we have going here. But you said like 20 different things that are all types of things that I'm thinking about a lot right now, strangely, and also things that come up on this podcast a lot.
Great.
And so I'm going to try to just break this down really simply, and hopefully this doesn't just kind of ruin what we have going.
But I'm a rambler, so feel free to just smack me down.
Okay. All right. So I can just interrupt when I need to. You're talking about kind of how media is shaping things and how shaping ideas of reality and unreality and things is something that I've started to think about, because this, especially in regards to this podcast, which came out of this idea of how do we talk about design is really what the question was, and what does design criticism mean, and
Mm-hmm.
are there other ways to talk about design or to quote unquote critique design
Mm-hmm.
in a deeper way aside from just looking at it aesthetically,
Mm-hmm.
is really what I was kind of interested in,
Yeah.
and that's kind of why one of the big reasons why I went to grad school. And as I've gone down that rabbit hole of kind of asking those questions, I've found that media theory and media criticism is actually a really good analogy, and a lot of the things people are writing about in regards to media,
Mm-hmm.
you can take and put into design, and it still works.
Sure.
So this is something that
Excellent.
there are a lot of parallels here that I see. That I think we could talk about. But then the other side of that is not just like what are the subjects that we talk about when we talk about design or design criticism, but are there other forms that we can use to critique designed artifacts, design culture, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Besides just the essay or like the history book or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think fiction is actually a really interesting way to do that.
Well, this is actually probably totally premature of me to say, but if you looked at Jacket Mechanical, my old blog at all, you might have seen that there were a few essays when I was working on various titles that I cared about. Often what I would do is I would sort of write something about that particular book, and it would be about the process of designing the book, but more than that, it would sort of be more about, sometimes they would be autobiographical but the most important bit is that I found, and this is not on purpose, I only realized this in retrospect, and it's so bleeding obvious to everybody, but the voice of that author would colonize the way I was writing those essays. So, the Joyce essay was, single long sentence, and that had to do.
And
you
weren't conscious of that?
Not while I was doing it.
Oh,
I mean, when the Joyce essay was done, I was like, oh, duh. I was just, this is, the, Molly's soliloquy or whatever. Yeah. A much shittier version. And that was not really a conceit as much as it was, I think, the sort of fallen effect of the sort of method acting that I sort of thought of as being the way that I would design a book jacket, that I would just like fully immerse myself in that author's world. And definitely like the Sebald piece was a good example.
That's what I was thinking of when you were talking about that.
Yeah, that Sebald piece definitely has his kind of, it's the same structure, it the same kind of...
even the black and white photographs that you had kind of interspersed.
And that one, by the time I was in the middle of that one, it started to become obvious to me what was happening there. But I started to think that would be a really interesting book in a way. A kind of...
Oh, interesting.
It would be sort of my version of like Maggie Nelson's like auto theory, is that it would be a way to tell a kind of... to do a kind of memoir through the filter of literature and design in a way that would hopefully inform all of those. Yeah. So I started to kind of collect, and I've made these things that I've never put anywhere, like I did one for Robbe-Grillet, and I have these things sort of like sitting around, and I was thinking that would be a very interesting form of design. I don't know what you would... I mean, it's interesting, you're looking for a new form of design criticism. I would just say in response that I think the most interesting works of art and criticism in general are those ones that are impossible to pigeonhole. Right. That you really can't say that they're memoir or criticism or, that they're very hard to put a label on. Those are the things that I like reading the most. And are the hardest to find publishers for. And but I am so bored of so many of the standard forms of fiction and criticism and design writing, and we've gotten to a point where it's just you really know what you're going to get when you crack the spine of most books nowadays. Right. And so I always I remember when I worked at Knopf, whenever there was a book that when it was launched, people just sort of people around the table they looked kind of like wall-eyed because they just didn't know what to do with any particular book because there was no easy comp title. It wasn't Da Vinci Code, or it wasn't 50 Shades, or it wasn't this or that. Were always the books that I was like, wow, I really want to work on that. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I think there are so many ways to write about design that are interesting. Yeah. And why not fiction?
Yeah. I mean, as you were saying that, I was thinking one of my favorite books of the last year or so was Teju Cole's Blind Spot.
Oh, yeah.
The kind of poetry memoir.
Yeah, he's awesome.
I mean, he's my favorite writer.
Yeah, why the hell not?
But that book especially seemed like a really interesting way that he brought all of these things that he thinks about and these different, I like the phrase you used of method acting, writing in different modes, pairing it with his photography, and it's kind of part fiction, part poetry, part photo critique.
Yeah.
And I've often thought, how would that look as a piece of design, like a design criticism?
Yeah, well, I think there's any number of ways to do it. I mean, the only sort of caveat I'll give is that I get a little bit nervous around the sort of like the total artwork idea, the sort of Gesamtkunstwerk thing, where it's like, I always think that something like that, it tends to be less than the sum of its parts. Like if the channels are competing, which they often are, I find that difficult. But I think, and I think Sebald, who just came up, is a very interesting example of someone who was extremely formally daring and managed to actually pave the way for people like Teju Cole.
Yeah, and actually, his novel is very much a Sebald novel in a lot of ways. Open City, I think.
Yes, absolutely. It is no doubt. And you could say that some of Sebald's works are themselves works of literary criticism as much as they are memoir, as much as they are fiction. Yeah. And I think there's a way to really create a gestalt when you're making something like that. And I don't see why fiction couldn't be design criticism. There's a part, one of my favorite sort of episodes in literature is the Proust's origin story in Remembrance of Things Past, where he's in the carriage and he sees the towers in Cambrai and he's sort of watching them as they kind of line up. It's this sort of
I've
evening
only started
moment.
that book a few times. I've never gotten all the way through.
But he's a young boy and he sees this thing happen where there are these two towers and the steeples, and they kind of line up for a minute, and it moves something in him, and he runs home and writes it all down. And it's sort of like it's like ground zero for Proust as a writer. And when I was writing my book, there's a lot of architecture in the book, weirdly, because I'm thinking about I'm so naive about writing fiction. I'm just like, how do people navigate spaces?
Right, yeah.
So you have to think about these things, and all of a sudden it's like, well, they're buildings, right? And what do those buildings look like? And so there's a scene where I have a character in a car, and I'm like, well, he has to be looking at something, and so there's a tower, and the tower moves, and I'm like, is there nothing else? And I'm like, well, there has to be something behind the tower. So there are these two buildings. All of a sudden I'm like, oh shit, this is the same thing that's happening in Remembrance of Things Past. And I'm like, well, I'm kind of writing about architecture now.
Yeah.
And
I mean, this is exactly what my next question was going to be, was how you start thinking about these things in your own work or in your own writing, especially. And the fact that this new book is a novel, but it's still dealing with all the same things that all of your work really is kind of thinking about. How did that... this is such a stupid question, I'm sorry, but why did that become a novel? You know what I mean?
Right. No, that is an
how
interesting
did that
question.
become the form that these ideas take this time?
I think it was just a kind of intellectual restlessness. It was a medium that I've just been very interested in trying for a while, and I just, the total control is a big thing. I mean, when you work as the big difference is, right, you work as a designer, you only have so much control. Your work is, at worst, parasitic to, at best, symbiotic with someone else's work. The authors, and then, obviously, like I said, they're the commercial interests, that whole vector that you have to consider. So, you only have so much agency as a designer. And, the great thing about making a painting or writing a sonata, or writing a novel, is that, it's all mine! It's like, fuck off, I can do what I want.
Right.
At any given moment. Now, that's terrifying, it turns out, also. But, it's something that everybody needs to try in their life. And even when you're writing criticism, to some extent, your work is, again, symbiotic with, or again, actually more often than not with criticism, parasitic to somebody else's work. So it's, it's freeing and, vertiginous and kind of crazy experience to
Yeah.
have. But I mean, the other thing I'll just add sort of biographically is that when I was a kid, I used to play Dungeons and Dragons.
Okay.
And I really love world building.
Yeah.
It's so geeky, but there's
Right.
something about just like and I mean, again, what we see when we read is about the imagination, right?
Yeah.
And so it is about world building.
Yeah.
And I think, specifically when you talk about book design, it's about a kind of world building that's constrained by someone else's.
That was just what I was going to ask you. Yeah.
And in a way that is a little like Dungeons and Dragons, where someone tells you you've entered a cave, and then all of a sudden you have to fill out you're fleshing out all the details yourself, that it is imaginative work that's prompted in some ways by someone else. So for me, the novel in a way is just, well, what if I just provided all the prompts and answers myself?
Right.
And then the lesson for me was, then I found that I overwrote everything because I was trying to fill in those gaps too much. And really, I have many good friends who are writers, and some of the best advice I had from people was just, where they would red pencil all this stuff and say you have to give your reader more credit to figure this stuff out themselves.
Right.
And, with a designer, you can't do that. You can't fill everything out for people.
Yeah.
That's just not the way it works. But with writing, the temptation is to really, give the reader as much information as possible.
Right. And that, it was just like this you just thought you had to do that.
I just didn't know what I was doing.
Worked.
Yeah. Listen, it's learning on the job.
Yeah.
I mean, and...
When did you realize that this was going to be a novel? Did you sit down saying like, I'm starting a novel, or were you kind of writing?
It was a real kind of like epiphanic kind of thing. I was literally out to dinner with this friend of mine who had just come back from Doha, and I'd asked him about this shirt he was wearing, which is really nice.
Right.
And he said, well, I got it from this place, the same shop, but they didn't really, they made it, but the original came from somewhere else. And I was like, what the hell are you talking about? And he's like, well, you go to these places. The amazing thing, there was a single detail that he told me that really spurred the whole thing, which is like, you just go to the counter, you put the thing down, and you say same. And I was like, in English, same? And he's like, yeah, same. And then I was like, what else do they do? And he's like, well, let's see. And then he started to describe the other things he'd have made, and I was like, this is everything. I really need to know everything about this. And that night I went home, and as it happened, I had just read John McPhee's, one of his pieces in the New Yorker on writing, the one in which he talked about his method of the sort of index carding of his nonfiction pieces. Yeah. And so, one of my kids
I just assigned that to my students, actually.
Listen, he's incredible.
Yeah.
And it just, my kid was working on a science project, and we had these stacks of index cards. So I was like, shoot. And I just saw the whole thing. And so I just started writing down on the index cards this story of this. Of course, the book changed a lot since that moment where I sort of plotted it out. But it was really just like a moment. Yeah. And I just, it spoke to everything that's interesting to me. The idea of the reduced form of something in the world is the key to everything in life, I feel like.
Was that different? Was that kind of process, that light bulb moment, different than your other book, or, even design projects?
It was different from the other book in the sense that the other book, listen, I had the idea for the other book in a similar way. It was just like, this is something I really want to write about.
It started
and then I sold it as a proposal, and then had an extremely short amount of time to actually put it together. There was no time to second guess anything, to rewrite anything. It was just 6 months of craziness while I was working at Knopf, while I was making cover, while I was doing my freelance work, while I was raising my children. It was insane. So this was different in the sense that I gave myself some time to work on it. So it was different in that regard. It was also different in the fact that there was no material to refer to.
Oh, right.
And that was scary in some ways. It felt like working without a net. On the other hand, it felt very freeing, because the worst anybody could say to you about the book is, I don't like what you do. They can't really say to you, you got it wrong.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
With nonfiction, there's always this worry that people will come at you for having misunderstood the problem, or I think it's with.
That's so interesting.
It's more like if someone doesn't like the book, it's like they would say to me like, I don't like the way you look.
Yeah.
And it was like, okay, you shrug
Yeah.
your shoulders and say that's just who I am. I do. I live with myself every day. And so there were a completely other set of sort of like desires and fears affiliated with it.
Yeah.
But also it's just a bigger process. I mean, this book, like I'm cutting it down from hundreds of thousands of words. It was a lot of words.
Yeah.
And what we see when we read wasn't, and cover wasn't.
Right.
And those words had an armature that was visual, and this is a purely abstract thing.
Yeah.
As it happens, and I won't tell you what the armature turned out to be, but the book turned out to actually formulate itself after something else in a way that was very, very satisfying in terms of the idea of duplication and simulacrums and simulation. By the time I was halfway through the novel, I realized that it was sort of following a very familiar arc. Mm-hmm. And then I very consciously built this book after another book.
Interesting.
So I'm hoping that will emerge to close readers, that they'll see that this book is actually a formulation of another book.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't mean to be, this is going to be such a reductive question, but what was that, you write these things, you have this idea, you write these things on note cards. It's this new medium that you've never really worked in before. Mm-hmm. You're still working.
Right.
Is this like you come home from work and you type a little bit? Like, how do you go from note cards to...
Most of what we see when we read was written on the subway.
Oh, wow. Okay.
In a notebook.
Yeah.
Just because...
handwritten.
Because I just didn't have time. And then I would get home and I would try to transcribe it onto my laptop. And like I said, it's not, it's more of an essay than a book-length thing. So that's not really such a big deal. But it turned out to be true for the novel as well. Like I still have to make a living.
Yeah.
It's most of my life is spent worried about money. Like I have 2 kids in private school, one of whom is going to college next year. And, we have the loan on this apartment, and it's not cheap to live this way. To have a family in Manhattan is, it's crazy. It's totally crazy. So most of my hours are spent thinking about how I'm going to bring money in.
Right.
And I have to do that work as well.
Yeah.
And man, you ask these questions where you would think you would have a very simple answer, and I go off on these tangents. So I apologize.
No,
I'm loving
this.
Okay. All I will say in response is that one of the reasons why this book is set at a arts colony, at a place where nobody has to do anything but be creative, was a kind of playing out of a fantasy for me. What would it be like to actually have the time? As it turns out, I have now built the time for myself through a series of freelance projects. But the method for the novel was really get home from Knopf, because I started it while I was still working there, and I would just make sure that I got a certain amount of words in every night. And after a while, I started to feel a little alone with that, so I got a bunch of friends of mine, incidentally, who were also at Knopf at the time, editorial assistants, other designers, to sort of convene once a month and sort of check in with our progress with one another. It's not a writing group. It wasn't a workshop. I like to call it more like an AA scenario, where it was just like we would keep each other on point. So I sort of convened this thing, and it really worked, actually. One other of the people has a novel that's completed. One of the editorial assistants sold his novel to Viking. It's coming out around the same time as mine. It was it was a great thing. Like we all pulled an oar, and we got each other over the hump. Yeah. And it's really important, I think, to not isolate yourself when you're doing something that's such a heavy lift. Yeah. Actually, I find that with reading, too. Like, I have a critical reading group that I have here, critical theory reading group. And, over the last fall and winter, we worked our way through some extremely dense and difficult texts that I just wouldn't have read unless I had other people sort of, and I'm a big... I don't really love collaborating on things, but I feel like there's certain kinds of projects where you just, the more the merrier. It just really helps to not feel alone with something, have other people's expertise. I'm a big believer in the editorial process for
Right.
that reason. So anyway, I guess the answer is that after a while, I just, I had this system where I would just get a certain amount of words in every day by hook or by crook. They were just word vomit. And, I knew that the writing of the book was going to be in the editing of the book. And that's always true. And you just can't believe how much something changes from your initial conception. The hardest part is just like making that huge chunk of rock, as everybody says, that you're going to chisel down. And the key to making it is just frickin' discipline. It's just doing it,
Right.
And that's it.
Well, I mean,
it's the key to it. It's the same thing as like learning a piece of music. You just, when I was a little kid, it's like you're just told you have to play a certain amount of hours, and it's the only way to learn something, and it's true. Yeah, I mean, now I just feel like I'm sucking up to you, quoting you back all the time. But one of my other favorite pieces in covers, when you talk about how the difference between design and music is that music, there's a performance, but design is this thing that's just endlessly kind of practicing. And I think writing is actually kind of similar to that, or could be similar to that. Yes, that's true, until the moment that the publisher takes it away from you. Right. Which is totally terrifying. But even then, what's interesting is the process doesn't end. Then the process is the descriptive process of the process itself. And as a designer, as someone who's affiliated with writing for so many years and have gone to so many book launches, I've heard so many people have to describe the writing process that you realize that there's this weird kind of after image of any work like that, in which the novelist has to construct what then actually becomes a kind of semi-fictional, as all autobiography is, a fictional account of what it's like to actually make the thing. And it's a kind of mythology then grows around the making of anything, and like the fiction never ends on some level. And if that speaks to what you're referring to. Yeah. Well, I mean, the reason that I asked the question about that kind of process question of how you did that with your day job basically is I really liked that art monster term, and that resonates with a lot of how I think about the work that I'm trying to do. And by the way, I'll just say I so love that you're interested in that constellation of media, because especially at the moment where I'm about to put a novel into the world, I feel so much self-doubt and fear and confusion around it. And to feel that there's anybody out there that would be encouraging of the idea of someone trying to investigate those intersections and parallels and finding ways that the media speak to one another feels very kind of heartening to me and kind of salutary. Like I would really love to not feel like amateurish. You know what I mean? And that's how you feel when you start to, the people really don't want you to step out of your runnel. Right. And it's not good for anybody. It really isn't. Like stepping out of runnels is how you get work that's challenging. And it's important, I think, for all of us to have work that's challenging, that isn't easy, that you can't kind of grok at once. And part of the problem, I would say, with obviously our nation in particular, but the world in general right now, is that we've become so habituated to things that are grokkable at a glance. And so, to use this word again, we've lost the richness and complexity that is the actual empirical world. How do we get that back? I think part of that is that we have to be a little more flexible about the definitions that we use. Not just for us as people, obviously for our professions, but for everything. We have to be a little more, I don't know what the word is exactly, but we have to be a little more critical of ourselves when it comes to pigeonholing things. And I think that's a huge challenge for all of us as human beings, but it obviously feeds into the work that we do. And if there was just a little more cross-pollinating of every possible kind in the world. Sorry, I'm building to a hallelujah moment, but I just think the world would be a better place.
I'm actually really glad that you said that, because that helped me kind of formulate the question that I was trying to ask you, because what I was trying to get at is I went back to grad school disenchanted with this term graphic design, feeling like it didn't fit the things that I wanted to do, which is why this term art monster is resonating with me so much. And I felt like if I wanted to be a critic or a design writer or even just a writer or a curator or a teacher, that those had to come from different places, that was different than design.
Right.
And what I've come to understand through these conversations, through grad school, through the work that I'm doing now, is that they all actually can kind of come from the same place, and that by bending those definitions a little bit or letting things start to talk to each other a little bit, that all of those things can actually fit under one thing. And so I'm kind of curious.
Absolutely.
I'm curious kind of how you think, like, was it literally you would go to work and you were a designer and then you came home and you were, like, how did those things start to talk to each other for you?
You know, my mind kind of ping-pongs around on a minute-by-minute basis. It's really, it's especially when I had an in-house job, it was hard because I was a little unfocused.
Yeah.
What's happened to me since I left Knopf, you know, there have been some moments, especially recently, where, you know, I would wake up in the morning and I would write for an hour or two, and I'd go over to the piano and I'd work on something, and then I'd sit down at the computer and I'd bang out a jacket, and then I would sort of cycle through those things again. And it felt so frickin' right to do them serially like that.
Yeah.
Because each time I would leave a medium, my mind would be totally fresh for the next one. And I would feel so much freedom all of a sudden. You know, the big thing about, like, I'll just writing, say, when you're writing a novel, the hardest thing about the writing is sort of having any degree of objectivity about what you're doing. That little bit of arm's length, that little bit of distance that'll tell you that, like, oh, you might be in, you know, the Kill Your Darlings, so you might be in love with that sentence, but that sentence honestly sucks and it's not serving the purpose of the book. And you only get that by being a little removed. You have to have some degree of alienation from your work. And writers will tell you that there are all kinds of tricks for this.
Right.
Change the font. Read something as your own thing as an ebook sometime. Read on a screen, print it out and read it. There are all these, like, sort of techniques of alienation that allow you to see the thing that you're working on. Comparably in music, anybody will tell you, and when you get to a really a reasonably high level at, say, the piano, your teachers will spend most of their time with you teaching you how to listen to what you're producing as you're producing it, which is the hardest thing to do. You're not listening to yourself when you're playing. You're idealizing the work that you're doing. So your head fills in those notes that you've missed, and anybody will tell you this. The hardest thing about being a performer is actually hearing what you're doing in any reasonably kind of objective way. So the great thing about cycling through media is that you get that kind of, you get the paradigm shifts, and all of a sudden you can see what you're working on from a distance because you were in a completely other world a minute ago. And it's been so helpful for me in all of those forms to be able to cycle through them in that way. And it's really enabled me to not have to be thinking about them all at once.
See, that's my problem. I mean, now this is just therapy, basically. But that's because I've been actually trying to do that, because I think that I've kind of thinking, you know, and working in some similar ways to you. My problem right now is when I'm doing the one thing, I'm thinking, oh, but I actually need to be doing that other thing.
Right. Well, I mean, the other side of that is I think that you just have to allow your mind to go where your mind's going to go, and you just have to follow it. And a lot of that is actually doing nothing, frankly. My wife always tells me, because I'm totally not aware of my own habits until she tells me what I'm doing. She's always like, how can you spend 3 hours, like, watching that soccer game or whatever? The soccer game's 90 minutes, but you know what I mean. How can you just, like, veg out that way? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, my brain has to just utterly turn off sometimes, and I have to allow that to happen. And, you know, similarly, if my brain is like, well, oh, you know, that cover could use X, Y, or Z, like, I'll just have to stop what I'm doing and go do that. And sometimes you have to listen to your own rhythms. I think that's hugely important. I mean, I would say the other sort of general principle, speaking of sort of being in therapy, is that I think the key to kind of stepping out of those runnels I was talking about, the sort of hard and fast divisions between the various things that you're working on, is allowing yourself to be able to, you know, if your mind's going to ping pong, let it ping pong. That can be profitable
Right.
to allow your mind to do that when it wants to do that. The other thing is to follow your own discomfort a little bit, to see what it is. And this is, this is an obvious therapy trick, right? So what are you scared of doing? What are you avoiding doing? What is the thing that you're trying to distract yourself from? And, actually that is a decent answer to your question of why a novel.
Yeah.
Like, I just found that the idea
Right.
the idea of doing that just seems so verboten on some level. So, like, what would you be thinking? That it was just something I had to do.
Yeah.
Like, I think if you listen closely enough to the things that your own, there's a wonderful book by Adam Phillips. Do you know him? The British
That name sounds
Freudian. He has a book on self-criticism
interesting.
that contains an article on self-criticism they published in the LRB. It's a super. I would.
This sounds really familiar.
I would totally direct you to this article because it's one of the most inspiring things I've read in a long time. What it's about is what is the self-critical faculty for, and the ways in which it abuses us.
Yeah.
And one of the things I took away from reading that is. This notion of you have to sort of, like, what are you being kept from and why? Like, why is this person yelling at you and telling you not to do X, Y, or Z? I think if you stand up in the face of that self-criticism, sometimes you find that that's how you end up in an interesting spot. And sometimes that spot ends up being a place, like I said, that's, uncomfortably on that spectrum between media.
Right, right.
Or is a constellation of them. Or is just one medium that you thought you weren't allowed to work in.
Yeah.
But as a therapeutic technique, I think it's a really good one.
Do you think I like this idea of kind of, putting your work at arm's length a little bit. And I wanted to make sure I didn't forget to talk about something that you had mentioned earlier, about how you would, while you were designing covers, you would kind of write little essays or memoir type things kind of in the voice. Do you think that was a way of doing that, or what did that writing, like, how'd that fit into this process, or why, I mean, I don't mean to say, like, why'd you do that, but
it's a question I've actually never asked myself, so I'm glad you asked it, and I'm going to try to be honest in answering it. I mean, part of it I think is, I said earlier, there's a kind of loneliness to making things in general, and I think, just the wanting to share it in some way that wasn't just it going out into the world as a book jacket. Somehow me putting a little more of my own gloss on it was a way of just sort of interacting with the world around the work. But I think probably the deeper and more honest answer is that the design itself didn't feel sufficient somehow. As work. That there's always been this part of me, and again, maybe it's that, like, Leonard Bernstein thing of wanting to be something that you're not all the time, but there was part of me that just felt like, okay, I've done this jacket and it feels good, but it also feels a little hollow, and I'm like, what like, is there more there? Like, what am I even doing here? I mean, I'm just like, I'm the kind of person who's just neurotic in that way. Also, I'm just like, always think, like, shit, like, is there any more? Like, what am I missing? So I think there's probably part of it that's just, okay, I made this thing, and tomorrow I'm going to make another. The older you get as a designer, too, the more you run up against this. I mean, the whole, like, what does it mean to be an older designer thing is fascinating. And, I'm turning 50 this year, which is nuts. But in design, like, I've only been working in design for 15 of those 50 years, so it still feels kind of fresh to me. On the other hand, I'm starting to experience that thing. Like, I know that if someone were to give me a job today, that I could probably bang out a reasonably good-looking, somewhat smart jacket, and it starts to feel a little like, but why? There's this feeling of, do you keep doing this thing? Like, how do you grow? Like, what is, and I think design in particular, because of the aforementioned commercial aspects and the aspects of it being kind of subsidiary to another art form, like, I think design is the kind of thing where you're bound to feel, if you're a curious and self-recriminating person, you're bound to feel at some point that this is not enough. I mean, I see, my friend Oliver Monday, who's a designer who I work with very closely, I'm watching him go through it now, and it's both exciting to see that he's got that intellectual curiosity. Like, it gives me an immense pleasure to see him want more. On the other hand, I feel for him because I know that it sucks to be given some sort of skill at doing something and then know that eventually you're going to leave it. Like, it's not going to.
Right.
I've been through that already with music. It's never fun.
Right.
So it's a real mixed bag.
Yeah.
I can't remember what we were talking about.
No, I mean, this leads in. I just have a couple more kind of quick.
Sure.
I mean,
yeah.
We'll see if they're quick
Sorry,
questions.
This has
just
been
to
so
kind of
digressive. I just
No, this has been great. Please don't apologize. But it leads into one of the questions that I wanted to kind of use to kind of wrap things up is, now that you've spent time writing and maybe you can call yourself a writer, has that process and working in that medium, I asked you earlier how design has kind of changed how you thought about writing. Has there been an inverse where now writing, whether just writing or writing fiction, even either way, has that changed how you think about being a designer?
It's definitely changed the way I feel about being a book cover designer, in the sense that I now way more viscerally understand what the client feels like.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, the process is fraught to begin with, and I think as designers, not just designers, publishing in general is a field in which, whether we're encouraged by our higher-ups to feel this way or not, or whether it's just natural to the environment, you begin to feel like you're just pushing widgets, essentially. And there's an almost kind of contempt for the author starts to arise in the business, and it's kind of shitty. Now I'm outside of it, and I'm kind of looking in from the outside and fogging up the glass, and I'm feeling like, oh, wow, like, we should just be way kinder to the talent because their lives super suck. Yeah. And, I think book cover designers, I've been very flip in the past about describing, I always say about the backlist, the authors are dead, so they can't disprove of what I do. And that's funny and true. And yet, it sucks to be on the other end. Yeah. It really does. Not that someone else is designing my book jacket.
I was going to say, are you...
Yeah, no, I've been forced to by my publisher on every occasion, and this is no different. I have been working on the cover for my novel, and hopefully it will come up with something that's okay. And that's... Man, is that a quagmire? And another story. Yeah, but my point is that, like, I'm trying to imagine now what it would be like for me if someone were to try to come up with a cover for Same Same, and how difficult that would be for me. Yeah. For somebody else to come up with the face for this thing. And it would be, I think, agony. So in that sense, this is just a publishing aspect. I now look at sort of the dynamics of publishing a book very, very differently. And I think it probably makes it harder for me as a designer to do a jacket for an author, because, just the fear of getting it wrong has it's become larger, that fear. But then in terms of the actual process, I mean, I think the greatest gift I've ever been given in terms of, in terms of the way I look at designing in general, is just a sort of understanding of the kind of base frivolousness of it as a career. And I still have that, more so now than ever. And it's always enabled me, I think, to do my best work when I sort of can feel sort of that it's not that important what I'm doing. And the less important it feels, the better I feel like I do at it.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So do you think, now that you're, kind of working for yourself, are you trying to design other things, like that are not related to books? Like, is that something that you're interested in at all, or? I
mean, yes and no. I mean, I have a series of freelance jobs. I designed one magazine recently that, I was downriver of one of these toxic men things, which was extremely intense. I built a magazine from scratch that never saw the light of day. Oh, right. Yeah. I will be working on another magazine. I'm making brands and logos and you name it, as well as book jackets. And, so I'm doing it, and there's always something to learn. So I guess, I mean, my heart's desire is not to be a designer for the rest of my life.
Okay, that's kind of what I thought you were going to say.
I mean, I have a rehearsal on Saturday for a trio that I play in. And, if life were anything like fiction, then it would all come full circle somehow, and I would really love for that to happen. I mean, so we're playing the Ravel A minor and the Beethoven Archduke, and man, playing music is just, there is, if you've got to rank the media, it's the one that definitely feels the most viscerally satisfying. So I don't know, who the hell knows? I mean, I don't really know what's coming up next, but I hope it wouldn't just be more of the same.
Right.
And if there's any kind of, if there's any, like, if I have like a heraldic sort of standard, like the motto would say like something, don't do the same thing in Latin.
I love that.
I just, because I don't want to be bored, I guess I'm sort of constitutionally,
I know exactly what you mean.
Sort of loathe the idea of just like sitting around.
Right.
So,
I know exactly what you mean.
We'll see. I mean, the novel will come out, and I'm assuming that probably 90% of the people who read it won't like it, or it'll be confusing to them. Again, I'll say the thing my editor told me not to say, which is a very weird book. But I hope that it finds those readers who are the kind of weirdos and oddbods and kind of spelunkers who want to like get in and are happy to be made uncomfortable by something and to not kind of understand what it is at first. And that would be a great joy to me. And I don't know, like, maybe there's more fiction to write. I as a kind of, this just came back into my head, but as sort of summary for basically everything we've been talking about, it occurred to me yesterday that a great title for a novel would be The Art Department. In all of its senses, because I think that, is it possible to write a novel predicated on a title alone? I don't know, but I think that might be the next thing I do.
Okay, all right.
And maybe it's multimedia.
I love that. I have two more quick questions. These are questions that I ask everybody to kind of wrap up. This podcast kind of ostensibly, or at the very high level, is about design criticism. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on, what are the issues or topics around design today, 2018, that maybe deserve a kind of critical lens turned to them that maybe you're not seeing?
Let's see. Looking over the design landscape, I would say there's sort of two issues. One's aesthetic, the other's pedagogic, I would say. And I can't speak to design in general because I occupy a pretty small kind of backwater of it, which is book cover design. But, looking over book jackets these days, there is just so much uniformity and homogeneity. It's really kind of disturbing. I've made some very ugly things in my life, book jackets, and, at least they were ugly.
Right.
I mean, the thing that I find really depressing is I spend so much of my life in bookstores, and I'm just like looking over the landscape right now, and there is a lot of dull, pretty look-alike jackets, and it bums me out. So just speaking to that sort of the aesthetic point,
I'm with you 100% on that one.
I would love to see people just try something weird or smart or just, I'm so, and that, I know why that is, that it's the path of least resistance, and publishers are not making a huge amount of money, and so they're nervous about things, and they want copycat
Well, it's not even just book covers, though. I mean, look at any Silicon Valley startup website, and it's all the kind of golden hour photography, the kind of humanist sans serif logo that's centered above it, the 3 boxes of what they offer. I mean, you could. I think you can put that to kind of any design area right now and say the same thing.
Same.
Nice.
Yeah, it's a bummer, and I'm really, what I'm hoping is, I see art departments in general are hiring art directors who tend to be more kind of like project managers than art directors back in the day. I remember when I started, John Gall was my first boss. He was an art director. He really fought for the weird shit that we would make, and he himself, was an amazing designer, still is an amazing designer, and he would teach by example, and there'd be friction in cover meetings
Right.
and, but good work got done.
Right.
And more I see art directors who are just, let's move the units.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's depressing, I
Right.
think. Especially when it comes to backlists, I think, where there's just so much opportunity to do so much interesting, expressive design.
Yeah.
But then the sort of the pedagogical component is that the state of design education is woeful in this country, by which I mean the emphasis on the education aspect of design, that there are so many illiterate designers being, I don't want to say produced, but sort of their money is being taken.
Yeah.
And then they're sort of like passed through the locks of this particular channel and out into the world without the proper faculties to actually make good work, a name for themselves, to do that most fundamental thing that design is supposed to do, which is communicate, both in written form and verbally, not to mention graphically. But the fact that the design schools don't find it incumbent upon them to teach the basic skills of reading and writing, I find really depressing.
Yeah.
And it almost feels like a racket, and it really kind of worries me. I'm whenever I've gone to a design school and kids ask me about, how do you get to whatever position you want to get to as a designer, I want to say to them, you got to read a lot. You got to write a lot. You got to think a lot. You got to figure out who you are and then be able to express what that thing is. And the only way you're going to learn how to do that is by reading and writing and speaking. Like that sort of triumvirate of skills, I think they're not being taught. And when they're not taught, design education's a scam. Because you're not giving people the skills they need to succeed. So that worries me.
I love that.
Yeah, and I feel like I would just love to see more mandatory classes in design schools where kids are made to read hard stuff. They're made to just like work on that muscle. And then when they write something that's incoherent, someone tell them that's an incoherent sentence and have it be explained why. And then hopefully the end result of that is that they learn what clarity of expression is, and then that can have that wonderful cross-pollination effect that we were talking about, where their design becomes clearer, they become, you become more an advocate for yourself and your work, which actually you need to be a decently paid designer in this world, right? I mean, there's just not... We don't work in a field that's highly remunerated, especially if you're working in graphic design. So if you really want to make money at it, you have to have a name that somehow is built outside of the work that you do. And the only way you do that is by talking about yourself and your work. And the only way you do that well is by becoming literate.
I mean, I love that. I agree with you 100%. If this podcast has any goal aside from finding these new ways to talk about design, it's kind of to look at that intersection between design and writing, and to kind of provide a reading list in a sense. Or,
good for you, man.
And so
I'm glad somebody needs to be doing that. I'm
trying.
We tend as a community to encourage one another downward. There's so much back patting and laurel sitting, and it's not good for us. And the fact that we're producing a generation that's less capable of sort of critical thinking, it's only going to drag the profession down. I mean, it's just redounds to all of us. And so I would really say that it's fantastic that you're doing this, and man, I hope more people in the field are encouraging other designers to read and write more.
Well, I mean, that leads into my last question, which is, who are the writers, or, do you have a list of books or the people that have influenced you, or, the writers that have inspired you, or if you were to provide a reading list of, here are the people that everybody needs to read, or
that's such a tough one, because I'm really... I mean,
I'm looking at I see the room.
There's a lot of books. I'm pretty omnivorous in terms of what I'll read. the stuff that's been really helpful to me in terms of learning how to write fiction, and by extension how to think about reading fiction, have been just wildly disparate kinds of writers. Like, I've been reading Flaubert and Beckett at the same time, which is like, I can't think of two more different, both stylists, obviously, but their interests were absolutely diametrically different. But any good writer is going to teach you something wonderful about not only the world, but ways in which to express what you found out about the world. Obviously Sebald has been a big influence on me, and a whole generation of writers, I would say, both in his philosophical commitments and his commitments to the visual arts, and his ability to write fiction that, as I was saying, is also criticism and is itself reading of other writers. It's very hard to read Sebald without thinking of, say, Kafka. And in a way, some books of his, you can say, are themselves works of criticism built on the works of Stendhal or Kafka or whoever it is. So I find that very interesting. He's one of those sui generis guys that, I think John Berger was the same way. I really enjoy his stories and his fiction. He won the frickin' Booker Prize for a novel. Like, he's not just the the BBC kind of like visual signifiers guy. And his writing was always, I really mourn his passing, because I felt like he was one of those guys who was really comfortable to straddle a fence. He felt okay doing that. And I mean, even his, I would say his most popular work, right? Which I'm sure you've
Ways
read.
of Seeing.
Ways of Seeing is itself actually, it's both an extremely creative work, but it's also a translation of the work of Walter Benjamin, and it's a work of criticism of other works of critical theory. He's just the most formally inventive writer and thinker that I know of, and he painted and drew, and I think he's as good a model as one could have.
I love that. I mean, he's the best. This was such a great conversation.
Oh, for me too. I'm sorry, I'm such a gas bag.
No, I mean, I feel like I could talk to you for another hour or so. Like, this was
hang around.
Thank you so much for doing this. It
was a pleasure. Thanks.
I'm a big fan and think this was great.
Well, thanks for talking to me.
This episode was recorded on February 28th, 2018 in New York City. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and SoundCloud, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.